So I'm out here at the property on a beautiful rainy spring day, right when everything is starting to wake up. Things are starting to grow. All the little spring buds are happening. I'm walking in the woods, and it's really great to see things that a lot of the plants, they go dormant in winter. And so I've got all these great varieties of native moss and all these plants. I'm hoping to do largely native plantings that are specific really to the Piedmont region of Virginia, to the foothills of Appalachia, which is where we're located. And I wanted to do mountain laurel, and I thought, oh God, where do I even find the right kind of mountain laurel at a nursery? A lot of the native plants can be really hard to track down. And I'm tromping through the woods, and here I see all these little evergreen shrubs here. These are all native mountain laurel. So I can just do cuttings and go ahead and put them all over the property in the woods. The woods on this side of the property, because they were previously owned by UVA's Morven, which is a conservation foundation. They replanted this at some point. This is a pretty young section of forest. You can even see over here where they've replanted. And then at some point, this small little strip of land, because it was problematic for them to access, they gifted it to the church many years ago. There's a whole batch of young pine trees down there. I'll zoom in for you. Yep. So this is not that old a section of woods. The woods on the other side of the property, significantly less evergreen pine trees, because these pine trees were all planted and then left to do their things for probably the last 50 years. A lot of the older pine trees in here are only about 50 years old. There's much older trees on the other side of the property, much more deciduous forest, significantly less evergreens. But there is also there are not a lot of understory plants like this mountain laurel I found. So I'm really looking to see what kind of understory plants do we have that are not trees. So I was very excited to find mountain laurel. I'll probably find some really great fungi and mushrooms, not necessarily the edible kind, but that are really good for the soil health of the woods. Also looking at where it makes sense for us to do a dead hedge to help with noise, because I'm sure y'all can hear all that traffic in the background. We're kind of right on the corner of two very busy roads in this rural area. They get a lot of high-speed traffic going 50 miles an hour, and it can be very noisy. So we definitely need some dead hedges for noise dampening, and also understory brush like mountain laurel. This is a little path that probably was created by a car once upon a time, but is way too overgrown and narrow for me to get my truck down here. I would have to come in, take down a few of the smaller trees, and really work on widening this path to make it accessible for my giant full-size truck. It's also great to see, since so much dies back in the winter, we've got all these little either wild blackberry or wild raspberry plants. Not sure exactly what they are yet, but we will find out as summer comes around. There's a whole patch of them here. We'll see if I can kind of cultivate them into something a little more usable. I also have some blackberries that are much more typical domestic variety. My friend gave me, because he had some in his yard and he's got way too many to kind of take over in Virginia if you're not careful. And so he gave me a few, and I'm going to plant them along the tree line here so that we can get some nice fresh berries eventually. I'm sure I will plant a lot of berries. But part of the thing to do is you got to keep them in check, because again, vegetation can be very aggressive in Virginia because we get a decent amount of rain. It rains about 100 days a year here, which is about 1 in 3. And even though it's not a nice even, it rains every third day or something, it's definitely clustered in seasons. It's enough that a lot of different kinds of vegetation, trees, plants, shrubs, weeds, grasses, understory plants, wild blackberries love to thrive here. So I'll be planting those. There'll be a lot more planting, a lot more woods management. I think I'm gonna have to get a chainsaw to deal with a lot of the already existing dead wood to put into a dead hedge. Some of it's pretty big, thick pieces that I might have a hard time toting around even with my truck unless I get a very small chainsaw, not a big one, to chop that stuff up. And then there are definitely some larger trees where I'm gonna need either a professional or a nice big strong guy like my husband to come and help chop that stuff up, just because there are some very big large trees falling on the other side of the property. One of the first things you've got to do when you're building in a rural environment is map out wells and septic systems. I've been working with a soil engineer who's locally here in the Charlottesville area, and he's helped me figure out what parts of my land are really good for septic drain fields, what kind of systems I need to be using based on my capacity, all those kinds of great, wonderful questions. And we identified this wooded area. This is a slightly older wooded area than the other side. This one was allowed to just be wild for probably the last 100 years or so. Prior to that, though, given how much clay and how rich the soil is here, I do wonder if at one point this area I'm standing in was farmed, because the clay goes pretty down deep and there are less rocky deposits here than in other areas. A lot of areas of the property you go to dig down and immediately you just hit lots of little pieces of rock like this, and they're absolutely everywhere. This section, the parts right up close to the cemetery, were probably not farmed because there are some pretty big hunks of rock sticking out. But in between the big hunks of rock, the soil's great. It's going to be really good for a septic drain field. We've got our corners marked by my soil engineer. There's one over here, if I can find it. We are gonna unfortunately have to cut down some trees. Yeah, there's my other corner. Got these big, beautiful hunks of slate coming up out of the ground. There's a reason why this was called the Slate Hill Meeting House, and then eventually Slate Hill Baptist Church. There I've got one of my septic corners. There's another one over there. You may not be able to see. It's flagged with a little yellow. Kind of hard to tell though with all the light yellows and greens from nature this time of year. Really amazing mosses and understory growth coming out. I'm very excited about that you just don't get to see in winter. It's beautiful to watch the land slowly come alive with springtime. So we're marking this off as one of the septic fields. Over here is not a great septic field area because it's extremely rocky. That's a small rock, but I'll show you some of the bigger rock formations we've got. Here's where we did some soil tests. You can see the soil here, because it's entirely clay, almost. It's very clay in Virginia as a whole. Even up here in the mountains, it just gets a bit rockier. It's literally red. It's this beautiful burnt orange red color. We got rocks here, rocks here. We got a whole bunch of old slates that just got dumped in the woods. I'll pick through those, and the ones that are salvageable I'll keep, because a small section of the front roof has slate, and then I'll need to maintain and restore for historic purposes. The historic renovation folks want that. But here we have a giant section entirely rocks. Just huge hunks of slate coming up out of the earth. Slate, slate, slate. Everywhere you look. And these are pretty big, some of these chunks. Just for scale, my teeny tiny little foot. And they're everywhere. Some of them are covered up with moss and different things. Some of them are jutting out all the way. Big hunks of slate. Too bad I don't know how to quarry slate. It'd be great to use some of that in a patio. This area is going to remain largely wooded. It does need a small amount of management, but because it's kind of been left undisturbed for a very long time, other than removing some of the fallen dead trees, some of them I should leave, it's good for the forest, and maybe putting in a few understory shrubs and ferns and things of that nature that are like the mountain laurel we found on the other side of the property. A lot of this is going to be left as is. Nature has kind of found the right balance of trees. You can tell here it's almost entirely deciduous trees, very few pines, very few evergreens. We got some evergreens up there along the line, but where the cemetery is, which is nice to have. But a lot of this will just remain, and I'll eventually would like to put a hiking trail through here. I will be putting in some dead hedges because we do have so much extra spare wood, and it does help with sound dampening. And I'm sure throughout this whole video you hear the cars rushing by, but I'm also very close to the road. If you were to zoom in, you can see one drive by in just a moment. You can always hear them coming.